Merkel Media.
I'm exhausted, looking for everything in the shadows. Start looking at people like they don't matter. I'm waking up to the fact, more than a little bit shallow. I'm lost in this hole, but I don't wanna. I'm lost in this hole, 'cause I'm just trying to
What's up, free range rabbits? We're back with another episode of Free the Rabbits, and I'm excited about this week. We're going to talk about werewolves. Now, I've done Ancient Dogmen, which was a fantastic episode that I love doing because I love talking about all the different dogmen throughout history. But what I didn't touch on at all during that episode was werewolves, because lycanthropy is vastly different than dogmen, which seems to have its own biological makeup. However, I think that dogmen and werewolves may have been confused throughout history and maybe even up until the modern day. I will say this, I'm going to do a different take than a lot of people in this conspiratorial, truther space, paranormal space on werewolves. So get ready. And I know that I may get some backlash for it. I hope everybody goes into this with an open mind. I'm not here to tell you that I don't think that the paranormal exists. However, I want to look at some deeper aspects, and it's something I've been talking about throughout the last year when it comes to what is going on in the conspiratorial space, the truther space, and it's a particular subject that I met with a lot of angst and a lot of pushback because people have a hard time being able to hear this particular viewpoint when it comes to the weird type of topics, the conspiratorial type topics, all of these different things. And I understand why, but at the same time, I think it needs to be talked about more. And I was talking to some podcasters recently about it, and they felt the same way. And it's tough because our audience a lot of times tends to be what I call conspiratorial junkies. They're just looking to mainline the next crazy thing, shoot it up, believe it immediately, and without any type of research whatsoever. Or they just listen to their favorite talking head who's just injecting them with fear poison. And I don't think that's how we're supposed to live. And I said that since day one. And I'm going to continue to push forward with that through the new year. And as I talk about werewolves, I'm going to look at this with a balanced viewpoint. And I want to make sure that I do that because I believe that there's a deeper aspect when it comes to lycanthropy that we should look at. And I think it carries over into everything else that we look at too. And I think it will help us. It's helped me. But again, I'm just setting the tone early. Before we get into this, I'm going to talk about the weird stuff for sure. There's no way you can get around it when you're talking about werewolves. And I'm going to tell you what I personally think about werewolves and lycanthropy Hey guys, before we get back into the show, I just want to let people know who have been asking how they can donate to the show to help with the show's growth. You can become a member here on YouTube. There are 3 different tiers. There is Nephilim Portal Babies, there is Nephilim Hunter, and Good Nephilim. Each one of them have a few different things that come along with them, but the one thing that comes with all of them is custom emojis that you can use in the live chats and in the comments below. I really appreciate all the love you guys have been showing. And listen, if you can't become a member, just you donating your time is one of the best gifts that you can give this channel. For now, let's get back into the show. And it all starts, in my opinion, with Sabine Baring-Gould. And he was an Anglican priest, hagiographer, antiquarian, novelist, folk song collector, and eclectic scholar. His bibliography is massive, just tons and tons and tons of papers and books, over 1,200 publications. And his list continues to grow because they keep finding more, so they publish them. And he's actually really well known as the writer of hymns, and he's best known for Onward Christian Soldiers and Now the Day Is Over. And he was born in a parish in St. Sidwell, Exeter, on the 28th of January, 1834. He was the eldest son and heir of Edward Baring-Gould, Lord of the Manor of Lew Trenchard, a Justice of the Peace and Deputy Lieutenant of Devon, formerly a lieutenant in the Madras Light Cavalry, by his first wife, Sophia Charlotte Bond. And I brought up his first wife because his second wife was Margaret Gould, and you'll know that because his last name, Sabine's, is Baring-Gould. And the reason why they conjoined the last names is because she's from the Gould family, descended from a certain John Gould, a crusader present at the siege of Damietta in 1217, for whose valor was granted in 1220 an estate at Seabro in Somerset. So because of John Gould's heroics in this siege of Damietta, the Gould family were very wealthy. So that would be a big reason why Sabine's father would want to conjoin the names. And he actually spent a lot of time traveling around Europe. And most of his education was private tutors because he spent 2 years in formal schooling, but because he had a crazy bronchial disease that plagued him his whole life, that his father thought it'd be better if they took him on the road with him on this European tour where they traveled around, and he was privately tutored. But he was stupid smart. In 1852, he went to Cambridge University and he earned degrees of Bachelor in Arts in 1857 and then Master of Arts in 1860. And he was deeply interested in the arts to the point he was a great painter. He painted window jambs with the Canterbury Tales and the Fairy Queen, and he wrote, he read all the time, and in 1864 actually took holy orders at the age of 30 and became a curate at Herbury Bridge, West Riding of Yorkshire. It was while acting as a curate that he met Grace Taylor, the daughter of a mill hand, and the next few years they fell in love. He ended up marrying her, and he was known primarily for his collection of folk songs that he made with many people that he lived with in Cornwall and Devon. And his first book of songs was Songs and Ballads of the West. But the other thing he was very well known for, outside of folk songs and writing hymns, he wrote a ton of novels, tons. And most of these were short stories that were put together in books. But some of the books he was most known for was A Book of Ghosts, and that was in 1904, In a Quiet Village in 1900. But probably at the top was the Book of Werewolves, and that was in 1865. And it is frequently cited in the studies of lycanthropy. So when it comes to what people in the scientific community and in the medical community consider lycanthropy, they got a lot of their ideas from Baring-Gould. And I understand why. And I've read the book. It's really good. He doesn't shy away from talking about the weird, which I really enjoyed, but he did take a very academic take on a lot of it too, which I also really loved. So I think when we're approaching this theory of lycanthropy, we have to look at all angles. And I do agree with some of the stuff he says in the book. However, some of it I don't, because I think he tends to go more straight-laced scientific than I particularly do. However, he was active in the church. He was a priest. So he completely believed in the paranormal, and he does talk about demonic possession in the book. And he tends to lean a lot that way when it comes to why people do certain things that others may look at and say, this person has changed into a beast. But I think there's enough that we can look at throughout history and enough that people have seen to say that, well, I don't think they were all fabricating or they all were seeing some sort of apparition, or in their fear, their minds projected some sort of beast. However, I think in some cases it could be that too. And I think that's what we have to do with anything in the paranormal. When we look at anything in the spiritual world, we have to look at all factors, because while I do take on people's stories that they tell me for face value, and I try to believe them, but I also know there's varying factors. There are some people that just outright lie, that fabricate stories to get attention. There are other people who think they see things, don't see things. And I know that's tough for people to hear. And I don't know how many times that I've been called a gaslighter for several episodes that I've done where I've suggested mental illness being a big part of the conspiratorial community. But I think it's something that needs to be talked about more. I believe that the conspiratorial community is a hotbed for people who have mental illnesses. And I say that because it's very easy for people who have mental illnesses to hide within the community, because we're all talking about crazy, weird stuff. So at least for a short time, they can seem normal. They probably feel normal too. But then the caveat is people do actually see weird things. People do understand that the government isn't in our best interest and they're up to no good. So there has to be this balanced viewpoint. I don't throw it out, and I don't say everybody's crazy either, but I do think we need to start taking a very hard look at this whatever, truth or whatever, community, and say there's a lot of people that need help, and we need to look at it that way. There's been so many people that I've run across in the conspiratorial community. Initially, everything's good, and then within a couple months, I just see them go off the rails. I'm like, oh, that's the real you. And they're super unstable, super unhappy, can't function in society. And their excuse is that, well, it's the government. It's because I can see the truth no one else can see. I can't connect to anybody else. But I also think that's the government too. That's that isolation factor that I talked about in the very first episode I ever did with the Cass Sunstein effect. That's what they want. They want you to isolate. It's like Christians who think they can't go to church because, oh, they don't believe in Nephilim like I do. They don't believe in the supernatural, the Bible like I do. I'm special. We're all special in God. And just because somebody doesn't believe or doesn't see what you do about angels mating with human women to create giants doesn't mean they're bad people or that you can't communicate with them. That's a lie from the devil too. So I'm just setting the tone because I am going to go in and out of the paranormal with werewolves. I'm going to talk about what I think because I am very much on board with a lot of this stuff being real. But I also know there's this other side of it that I can't just push away and say, oh, they put that out there to discredit this wild paranormal stuff. While some of that may be true, it doesn't mean that all of it's fake. I said this since day one. Everything ain't fake. Everything ain't real. You got to have a balanced approach with this stuff. And we're not doing enough of that. And frankly, it's a disservice to others around us when we don't. So I'm going to get right into now Sabine Baring-Gould, one of his personal stories that he starts out with. Then I'm going to break down different aspects that he talks about throughout the book. I'm going to talk about what the medical field speaks of when it comes to lycanthropy. And then I'm going to dovetail it into biblical lycanthropy. And I think that's going to give us a good full scope of how we need to look at this subject. So we're not just running off the rails 24/7 with everything. So Sabine Baring-Gould talks about one night he's walking in Vienna and he accomplished the examination of an unknown druidical relic, the Pierre l'Abbé at La Rondelle near Champigny. And he said he had learned about it since his arrival in Champigny in the afternoon, and he wanted to check it out. And he did some sketches on it. Now, it started getting late, and he saw a small hamlet, and he decided to go there, but few of the people there could speak French, except for the priest there. And he asked him about what he could do to procure a ride or a horse because he needed to get home to his family because they had an early start they needed to make in the morning. Now, the mayor was also there, and the mayor said, Monsieur can never go back tonight across the flats because of the loup-garou. And if you know what loup-garou is in French, it is the French word for werewolf. And you'll hear this in America as well, especially places that have people who use Cajun dialect. The priest tells the mayor he must return who's going to go with him. And the mayor says, well, one of us will accompany him, but think about if that person leaves and then comes back alone. So the priest says, two must go with you. So they start haggling out the mayor, the priest. And then finally Sabine says, you know what? I'm just going to go out alone. He said, if I meet the loup-garou, I will crop his ears and tail and send them back with my compliments. So they all kind of laugh, and he leaves. He says the sky's perfectly clear. He doesn't see any sign of habitation on the roads. And he knew that in that area, there probably could be wolves, but he also started to think of the superstition of the loup-garou and werewolves and the habits of mythical creatures. And that's when he decides that he should start studying the topic of lycanthropy. And he wanted to put together a book that would represent it, not just the mythology, but what he thought the modern world needed to understand about it. And I can appreciate that from him because he did a lot of research, met with a lot of people, gathered a lot of stories. Obviously, the book's too long. I'm not going to go through the whole thing today, obviously. We're going to go through just some of the high points because it's going to help us really look at a broad overview of this particular topic. Now, he starts out with what is lycanthropy. And he says the change of manner woman into the form of a wolf, either through magical means so as to enable him or her to gratify the taste for human flesh, or through judgment of the gods and punishment for some great offense. He said this is the popular definition. Now, he says, truly it consists in a form of madness, such as may be found in most asylums. Among the ancients, this kind of insanity went by the names of lycanthropy, quanthropy, boanthropy, because those afflicted with it believed themselves to be turned into wolves, dogs, or cows. But in the north of Europe, as we shall see, the shape of a bear, and in Africa, that of a hyena, were often selected in preference. So he said, depending on where you would go throughout the world, you would have different versions of people changing into different animals. And he goes through that some throughout the book. I have talked about that before on the show. I've talked about hybrids plenty of times on the show. And I do think that shapeshifters exist. I've been to Utah. I've met with the Native American tribes there and spoken to several people of those tribes. And they've had stories that have traveled down for hundreds of years to them. And not only that, they have modern stories of people being able to shapeshift and change. So I don't think for a second it's not possible by any stretch. And I think that's the one part that he doesn't buy into as he's writing the book. But I can understand why, because this is the 1800s. They're coming out of these eras where people believed in all these weird things. And don't get me wrong, I think a lot of them saw weird things for centuries. But I do think that there is an element of what he's talking about is madness and people who seriously have mental health issues. And there is another form of lycanthropy I think that we have to look at too. And he specifically talks about in this book. Now, early on, he goes into some of the ancient tales, which I'm going to talk about. We're going to start with Herodotus. And if you remember, I talked about Herodotus on the Dogman episode that I did. He was very important when we were talking about the cynocephali. And he was a Greek historian geographer from the Greek city of Halicarnassus under Persian control in the 5th century BC. And he wrote the book Histories, which was one of his most important works. And he had everything from geography to the history of wars, and then a lot of crazy stuff too that he said that he saw during his travels. Now, he's criticized at times for his inclusion of legends and fanciful accounts in his work. At least that's what historians say. But the crazy part is a sizable portion of the histories has been confirmed by modern historians and archaeologists. So every time they're digging into stuff about the book he wrote, they keep finding it and like, oh, well, that was proved right. Oh, well, that was proved right. So why is it that we're just throwing out the wild and what they say fanciful stuff? I think that when you've got so many different writers and historians writing about these things that they saw, that we have to kind of take it on board and say that, well, it's a huge possibility. So in Histories, Herodotus says, it seems that the Nuri are sorcerers. If one is to believe the Scythians and the Greeks established in Scythia, for each Nurian changes himself once in the year into the form of a wolf, and he continues in that form for several days, after which he resumes his former shape. So he said that he saw this on his travels to Scythia, and the Nuri or Navari were an ancient Slavic or Baltic people whose existence was recorded by ancient Greco-Roman authors. The Nuri belonged to a group of Northern European peoples of unknown origin, but most researchers propose an ethnic group ancestral to the Slavic, Baltic, or larger Balto-Slavic peoples. And Herodotus even talks about that they once had to leave their country because of an invasion of snakes. So apparently, and he wasn't the only one that talked about it, that all of these snakes invaded the country and they had to leave. Some people attribute that to the fact that they were werewolves, and there's some connection to the fact that these snakes did not like that they're werewolves. And this is just guesstimating at this point. They don't know why they left because of the snakes. That is one of the big things about why they originally left their country. Now, some people suggest that the Nuri performed cults in which they wore wolf skins en masse, and the wolf might have been a totem animal of this tribe. You're going to hear that a lot too when it comes to these groups of people throughout history being werewolves, where they'll say, well, yeah, they were just putting on the skins of animals. And I'm not saying that isn't possible too, and I think for sure that happened. And we're going to talk about some Nordic legends here in a little bit too. This was Herodotus saying specifically that they changed. And again, he is one of the big ones that we go to when we're looking at ancient hybrids and some of the weirder aspects around the world. Now we're going to go to Pomponius Mela, who wrote around AD 43, was the earliest known Roman geographer. He was born at the end of the 1st century BC and died in AD 45. And he also talked about the Nuri, and he said, there is a fixed time for each Nurian at which they change if they like into wolves and back again into their former condition. So we've got two writers talking about the Nurians and them changing shape. So we have to look at this with a level of interest and say, what's possible? Herodotus and Pomponius saw this and they wrote about it. Now, one of the most famous stories of lycanthropy comes from Publius Ovidius Naso, and in English he's known as Ovid, and he was born the 20th March 43 BC, died in AD 17, and he was a younger contemporary of Virgil and Horace, with whom he is often ranked as one of the three canonical poets of Latin literature. He's most famous for the Metamorphoses. It's a continuous mythological narrative in 15 books written in dialectic hexameters. It remains one of the most important sources of classical mythology today. And the reason why I bring that up is because of the story of Lycon, king of Arcadia. And in the most popular version of the myth, and there's so many different versions of it, just like with Roman mythology or Greek mythology or Akkadian mythology, Babylonian mythology, Sumerian mythology, you'll see variations. Egyptian mythology, that's a good one too, especially when looking at Horus. Horus has got a jillion origin stories, but very similar. The most popular version is Lycon killed and cooked his son and served him to Zeus to see whether the god was sufficiently all-knowing to recognize human flesh. Disgusted, Zeus transformed Lycon into a wolf while he restored Lycon's son. And in some stories, especially Roman versions of the story, you will hear this Zeus character or god, little g god as I call them, swapped out with Jupiter, because they're essentially the same deity. So Ovid in Metamorphoses, this is what he says about Lycon. In vain he attempted to speak from that very instant. His jaws were bespluttered with foam, and only he thirsted for blood as he raged amongst flocks and panted for laughter. His vesture was changed into hair. His limbs became crooked. A wolf he retains, yet large trace of his ancient expression. Hoary as he is afore, his countenance rabid, his eyes glitter savagely still, the picture of fury. So this is him explaining how Lycon changed into a wolf, a werewolf. We're going to jump to a version that Pliny the Elder talks about. And again, this is another name that I've talked about before in the ancient Dogman episode that I did. And he also has talked about the cynocephali and werewolves, as you're going to find out here. And he was a Roman author, naturalist, and navy and army commander of the early Roman Empire. And he wrote the encyclopedic Naturalis Historia, natural history. And it was a comprehensive 37-volume work covering a vast array of topics on human knowledge, as well as a lot of weird stuff. And he says that on the festival of Jupiter, Lycius, one of the family of Antitus, was selected by lot and conducted to the brink of the Arcadian lake. He then hung his clothes on a tree, plunged in the water, whereupon he was transformed into a wolf. 9 years after, if he had not tasted human flesh, he was at liberty to swim back and resume his former shape, which had in the meantime become aged as though he had worn it for 9 years. So Antitus, known to the Berbers as Anti, was a figure in Berber and Greek mythology, and he was famed for his defeat by Hercules as part of the labors of Hercules. And he was the son of Poseidon and Gaia, and he lived in the interior desert of Libya. So it gives you an idea of who Pliny was talking about. So this is just another ancient story of a werewolf, and there'll be several of these. And that's the point I'm trying to make, that they all are talking about the same type of activity, and I don't think completely made up. Now, I do think the stories can be embellished, and I think names can change, but I do think the basis of a lot of these stories are built on the gods. And you know what I think about the gods and these Elohim, these lesser G gods. And I do think that the idea that someone can change shape, some sort of ritualistic magic, is highly possible. And we've got a really cool story from Gaius Petronius Arbiter, and he was a Roman courtier during the reign of Nero. And he talks about a personal story, which is very interesting. And his master had gone to Capua to sell some old clothes. So he seizes the opportunity, and he persuaded his guest, who was staying with them, for he was a soldier, accompany him about 5 miles out of town. And he said, as they're walking, the moon shone bright as day. When coming among some monuments, he said the man began to converse with the stars while he was jogging and singing, counting the stars. And when he looked back at him, he said he stood like a corpse because the man had turned into a wolf. And he said, don't think I'm joking. I would not tell you a lie for the finest fortune in the world. So he keeps telling the story, and he says the now werewolf howls, runs to the woods, and he was going to take the man's clothes, but the clothes had turned to stone, so the sweat's pouring down him. He runs back. He talks to Melissa, who also lives where they live, and she was wondering why he was out so late. And she said, had you come sooner, you might have lent us a hand, for a wolf broke into the farm and has butchered all our cattle. But though he got off, it was no laughing matter for him, for one of the servants had ran through him with the spike. So he's already sweating, and he says he comes back to the place where the clothes had turned to stone, and he sees a pool of blood. And then when he got home, he found the soldier lying in bed like an ox in a stall, and he's surgeon dressing his neck. And he said, I saw at once he was a fellow who could change his skin, and never again did he hang out with the man. So when the man had turned back to a man from a wolf, where he had been stabbed with the spike as a wolf, he was being patched up by a surgeon. And that's how Petronius knew that he was a werewolf. So another wild story about werewolves. So to really get to the heart of the matter, we want to jump to Norway, and there's a lot of werewolf lore and Norse tradition, and certain men were said to be Igi Inhamar, not of one skin, and it has its roots in paganism, and men could take upon them other bodies and natures of those beings whose bodies they assumed. And that's one of the forms of werewolf. Now, you've got a second version where the adopted shape was called by the same name as the original shape, hammer, and the expression made used to designate the transitions from one body to another. So basically, you could take your essence, move it into the body of another person, another animal, generally another animal, and you would basically avatar that animal. Just think of the movie Avatar, where they go into another body and control that other body. Now, the third kind, and this is one of the ones that I find the most interesting, especially when it comes to ritual magic, this third manner of producing the effect was by incantation. The form of the individual remained unaltered through the eyes of all beholders, were charmed so that they could only perceive him under the selected form. So you still look the same, but you are imbued with supernatural powers by whatever entity, whatever ritual magic you did. But because of that ritual magic, when people look at you, they perceive a beast. They perceive whatever projection is being projected around you. I find this one the most fascinating. And I also think this is one of the most likely ones when we look throughout history. And the reason why I say that is I'm not discrediting the fact that skinwalkers exist, shapeshifters exist. I believe that the idea that through some sort of ritualistic magic and being in contact with negative entities, they could create a projection around you to make it look like that you had transformed into something else. And I find this one on the scale of probability the highest as far as what we're looking at in the paranormal. Again, I'm not discrediting skinwalkers or shapeshifting. I just think it's less on the probability chart of what people see. I think this is very high. And I thought this was very interesting out of the three that this one really could work. If you know the right ritual magic, you could just create a hologram essentially around you that would appear to be that you had taken the form of some unnatural beast, and with the power of some negative entity or entities, you would perform like the beast that's being projected to someone else. We're going to jump to medieval times now. Again, I just want to touch on a few stories here and there. I've got an absolute ton of stories from each era, but I want to talk about some of the most famous and to give you an idea throughout history of what people have thought about lycanthropy. We're going to talk about Olaus Magnus. He was born October 1490, died in August of 1557. He was a Swedish writer, cartographer, and Catholic clergyman. And he talks about in Prussia, Livonia, and Lithuania, although the inhabitants suffer considerably from the rapacity of wolves throughout the year, and that these animals rend their cattle, which are scattered in great numbers through the woods, whenever they stray in the very least. Yet this is not regarded by them as such a serious matter as what they endure from men turned into wolves. So he starts it out with, hey, they know wolves. They know wolves very well. They know wolves attack their cattle. It doesn't bother them. But then he talks about on the feast of the nativity of Christ. I find that very interesting. At night, such a multitude of wolves transformed from men gathered together in a certain spot, arranged among themselves, and then spread to rage with wondrous ferocity against human beings. And those animals which are not wild, that the natives of these regions suffer more detriment from these than they do from true and natural wolves. For when a human habitation has been detected by them isolated in the woods, they besiege it with atrocity, striving to break in the doors, and in the event of their doing so, they devour all human beings and every animal which is found within. He said they burst into the beer cellars. He said, and this happens in Lithuania, Livonia, and Courland, and this is all done, he said, with the black arts. And he said they will attack castles. And he said that sometimes when the fattest of them can't get over the walls as they're changing back into their human forms, they get destroyed by the captains and are slain of these castles. So he talks about it in depth. And I think it's very interesting that he makes a point to say that, well, the people know what wolves are. Wolves attack us all the time. So this wasn't a place where wolves didn't exist, and they knew exactly what they were. So I do find that fascinating. Now, is it a projection like we talked about a little bit ago? Is it the black arts or the dark arts or ritual magic? They are given some sort of supernatural power by these negative entities, and they're projecting out this wolf-like appearance. I don't know. Or are they changing into these werewolves? I think it's something, and I don't think we can look at these types of stories and say, oh, this pack of people all had some sort of medical version of lycanthropy, and they're all insane or crazy. I don't buy that either. And I know Sabine Baring-Gould leans into that heavily in the book. However, he does talk about demonic possession and demons possessing people, and that's why they are overtaken with this power, or they become cannibalistic, or they just have this insatiable need to kill people. He does talk about that. He doesn't shy away from the fact that they could be demonically possessed, but I think you gotta blend the two. You gotta look at this as also a real thing, not just some sort of medical condition. There's another story in medieval times from John of Nuremberg, and he relates the following story. A priest was once traveling in this strange country and lost his way in a forest, and he saw a fire, and he makes his way towards it, and he sees a wolf seated over it. So the wolf starts talking to him in a human voice, tells him, don't fear, he's from the Osirian race, of which a man and a woman were doomed to spend a certain number of years in a wolf's form. And you'll see this a lot with werewolf stories, where there'll be a werewolf for 7 years, there'll be a werewolf for 9 years, or it'll be a specific amount of time that they're cursed with this. And he says that only after 7 years might they return home and resume their former shapes. That's if they're still alive, because they can die in their wolf form. And he begs the priest to visit and console his sick wife and give her the last sacraments. The priest does it, and he observes that the wolf uses his front paws like a human does. So he realizes that, well, this wolf doesn't have some demonic entity speaking through it, and it's a real wolf. And he ends up seeing the she-wolf peel off her wolf skin from her head to navel and exhibiting the features of an aged woman. And that's when he realizes that they are actually human beings that were changed into wolves. Very interesting story. There was also, during medieval times, a paper written by Ranius on the Courland about werewolves. And he says just what I've been saying this whole episode. There are too many examples derived not merely from hearsay, this is his words, but received on indisputable evidence for us to dispute the fact that Satan, if we do not deny that such a being exists, and that he has his work in the children of darkness, holds the lycanthropists in his net in 3 ways. So he breaks down 3 ways that he thinks that this exists. He says that the demonic entities execute actual wolves to certain acts, such as seizing sheep, destroying cattle. It's not man changing into it, because he doesn't believe scientifically that man can. So he's still on the fence. He's more like Sabine Baring-Gould in that it's definitely something from the other realm, but there's a scientific way to explain it through the supernatural, if that makes sense. Because I know we're talking about the supernatural, we can go way out there, which I'll go. So that's his first example. His second example is that the people imagine in a deep sleeper dream that they injure the cattle, and this without leaving their house, and their master actually does something to the cattle and points it out or suggests it to them that they did it, and then, oh, I turned into a werewolf, which is an interesting concept too. That's a lot of trickery, and maybe you could trick somebody into thinking that they were a werewolf and they actually weren't. So his third example is the evil one drives natural wolves to do some act and then pictures it so well to the sleeper, immovable in his space, both in dreams and at awakening, that he believes the act to have been committed by himself. So this is the combination of the first two, where it's demonic entity takes over a wolf, you're asleep, demonic entities tricking your brain into thinking that you changed into the wolf, you wake up, things were attacked and killed by a wolf, and you think you did it. So I think that all of those things could be very well true. I like them. And again, I think when we're looking at these paranormal / supernatural topics, we have to look at every single possibility. We can't just go with one. We have to say that all of these things exist and that we may never be able to get to the bottom of it unless we ourselves witness something. And even then, our minds can play tricks on us, say there were negative entities playing tricks on us. There are so many variables even with that. And I know it's tough for people to hear. I know what I saw. It's like the Mandela effect. I know I saw it. I know it. It happened. It did. And maybe it did. You know what I mean? And I'll go to the Mandela effect a lot because it's one that specifically deals with what we remember, what we see. And I think this applies also to the paranormal world. We have to look at everything in a very broad view and say that, yeah, I saw something strange. It looked like this. We may never know exactly what that thing is. And then again, we might be able to. You know, we could see Bigfoot, right? But not actually know what Bigfoot is. Oh, I saw Bigfoot, but there's so many variables to seeing Bigfoot. Was it actually Bigfoot? What is Bigfoot? Are there multiple different versions of Bigfoot? Was it something supernatural that manifested to look like Bigfoot? Was it what we would call the Fae, which would be in the same category as that? There's so many variables to this unseen realm that until we are transcended to a life with Yahweh and we are privy to all of these things in the manner in which it should be looked at, we'll never really know. And I think that's what we've got to get away from too, that I hope, and I've noticed so many people listening to the show are on board with this, that we've got it figured out. Oh, I know. I saw it. Or I know because I know. That's a good one too. I hear that all the time. I know because I know. None of us know. I don't know. I can research all day and I'll never know, but at least I'll have an idea of what it could be. And we're going to start transitioning into this medical field of lycanthropy because I definitely want to talk about that because I think it's important. We got to look at this legitimately too. And we're going to talk about Petrus Forestus, and he was one of the most prominent physicians of the Dutch Republic. He was known as the Dutch Hippocrates. And he had an aversion to quacks, charlatans, and the unauthorized practice of medicine. So he actually wrote a book on charlatans, frauds, and the trickery and deceit with false medicine. And he specifically about lycanthropy. And he had a chapter on the maladies of the brain. And he talks about a circumstance he came across by his own observation. And this was in the middle of the 16th century at Alkmaar in the Netherlands. He said a peasant there was attacked every spring with a fit of insanity. Under the influence of this, he rushed about the churchyard, ran to the church, jumped over benches, danced, and was filled with fury, climbed up, descended, and never remained quiet, carried a long staff in his hand, which he drove away the dogs, which flew at him and wounded him so that his thighs were covered with scars. His face was pale, his eyes deep sunk in their sockets. Forestus pronounces this man to be a lycanthropist. But he does not say that the poor fellow believed himself to be transformed into a wolf. He does mention that there was a Spanish nobleman who he knew that believed himself to change into a bear and wandered among the woods in fury. So he uses that as a juxtaposition to say that this peasant man did not think that, but he acted in such a manner that he would call him a lycanthropist. And that's more of what we're sliding into this modern version of what people think is lycanthropy. So this gets us into Sabine Baring-Gould later on the book. He does a chapter, it's chapter 9. It's called Natural Causes of Lycanthropy. And this is where he starts revealing what he really thinks about lycanthropy. And he talks about in the Middle Ages, when they had trials where they charged people with the crime of lycanthropy. And he says, we can arrive at the truth respecting that form of madness, which was invested by the superstitions with so much mystery. So to him, these people were mad, and there were superstitions that were made because of it. But I do like the fact that Baring-Gould has chapters upon chapters upon chapters of tons of stories, tons of research, which I only gave you a small portion of it because it's very lengthy. And a lot of those researchers and people who have seen this stuff said that, well, you can't just throw it out and say that people are just seeing a bunch of mad people. So at least he gives you the other aspect of it, but he's telling you in this book, he's leading up to what he really thinks. He says it was not till the close of the Middle Ages that lycanthropy was recognized as a disease, but it is one which has so much that is ghastly and revolting in its form, and is so remote from all our ordinary experience that it is not surprising that the casual observer should leave the consideration of it as a subject isolated and perplexing, and be disposed to regard as a myth that which the feared investigation might prove a reality. So back to, he thinks it's a myth. And he thinks as we're digging into the way that the brain works, that these people are just absolutely insane. But there's another aspect that we're going to talk about that I think is very, very important, that when you read the book, Gould builds you to it. And I kept seeing this, oh, this guy took this salve, this woman took this salve. And he makes sure to let you know that, but doesn't express what he thinks about it until later on in the book. And then this is when he starts talking about it being a form of madness and it being in your mind. And then he starts talking about salves that were used by witches for the purpose of transformation. And he gets deeper into what he talks about as hallucination, which can be produced by artificial means. So now you're probably putting the pieces together because I just brought up the salve, getting into what this salve could possibly be. And he brings up a story of a man who goes to a witch and he sees her divest herself of all her garments and unlocks a chest and takes from it several little boxes and open one of the latter, and it contained a certain ointment. And rubbing this ointment a good while previously between the palm of her hands, she anointed her whole body, from the very nails of her toes to the hair on the crown of her head. When she was anointed all over, she whispered many magic words to a lamp as if she were talking to it. She began to move her arms, first with tremulous jerks, and afterwards by gentle undulating motion, till a glittering downy surface by degrees overspread her body. Feathers and strong quills burst forth suddenly. Her nose became a hard, crooked beak. Her toes changed to curved talons, and she was no longer herself, but it was an owl I saw before me, and now uttering a harsh, querulous scream, leaping from the ground by little and little in order to try her powers, and presently poising herself aloft on her pinions, she stretched forth her wings and flew away. And so this man's rubbing his eyes, and he wants to do it. So after she creeps back in the apartment, she returns back with a box of ointment and placed the ointment in his hands. So he's jacked, takes all his clothes off, rubs it on his body like she did, and it happened the way he wanted it to. He didn't grow feathers. He didn't grow a beak. He became a donkey, and he was not happy with this. But the point of the story that Sabine Baring-Gould is saying from this medieval story that he tells is he's trying to get to the bottom of what the salve is and what these witches were putting in the salve. And he says that they were composed of narcotics, to wit, to the max. He names off several: aconite, belladonna, opium, several others. He said they were boiled down with oil or the fat of little children who were murdered for the purpose. And he says also the blood of a bat was added, and he doesn't think the effects of the blood of the bat had anything to do with it. He said, but that's something they would do. And he said that they may even added other foreign narcotics, the names of which he doesn't even know. So his idea is that the rubbing of the salve on the body with this crazy hallucinogen, and essentially, we talked about the blood of children. Well, we know where that can go, even in modern times. So we know that that in and of itself can be hallucinogenic, a whole nother aspect. So he says it's not surprising that the lycanthropist could have imagined him or herself transformed into a beast. So that was his scientific take on it. And again, I'm not throwing it out. I'm not saying it's not possible because very well is. It's a very logical take on lycanthropy could be. But I just think it's an aspect of it, right? I don't think that we can narrow it down to any one particular thing, but I do love the fact that there's enough research out there that we can say, well, depending on the situation, it could be one of several different things. So I'm going to go neck deep in the lycanthropy as a medical condition. So some modern researchers have tried to explain the reports of werewolf behavior with recognized medical conditions. In 1963, Dr. Lee Illis of Guy's Hospital in London wrote a paper on porphyria and the etiology of werewolves. And he argues that all historical accounts on werewolves have been referring to victims of porphyria, stating how the symptoms of photosensitivity, reddish teeth, and psychosis could have been the grounds for accusing a person of being a werewolf. So porphyria is actually a group of disorders in which substances called porphyrins build up in the body, adversely affecting the skin or nervous system. The types that affect the nervous system are also known as acute porphyria, as symptoms are rapid in onset and short in duration. And it has a lot of different side effects: abdominal pain, chest pain, constipation, fever, high heart rate, and attacks may be triggered by alcohol, smoking, hormonal changes. So the skin's affected. The skin changes, blisters, itching, causes people to have seizures, go mad. So this is what his definition of it is. I think it's a weak one personally, but I'm not saying that it can't be some cases. That can't be all of it. As a matter of fact, writer Ian Woodward wrote a book called The Werewolf Delusion in 1979, argued against that. And he points out how mythological werewolves were almost invariably portrayed as resembling true wolves, and that their human forms are rarely physically conspicuous as porphyria victims. So he actually goes a little bit further, and he suggests rabies as the origin of werewolf beliefs, claiming remarkable similarities between the symptoms of that disease and some of the legends. And he focuses on the idea that being bitten by a werewolf could result in the victim turning into one, which suggested the idea of a transmittable disease like rabies. And the detractors from that say that the idea that being bit by a werewolf to turn yourself into a werewolf is a very modern take. You don't hear of that in ancient times at all. So it is more of a modern take, within the last 100, 150 years. It's not, you don't see this in any ancient literature about how people can change into wolves or werewolves. This is more modern. So he's got an interesting mix of what he thinks it is, and he lends more to rabies being the term in the scientific community. So he pushes back on the porphyria idea that Dr. Lee came up with. So there's a lot of dissension between this clinical lycanthropy idea between a lot of different people. And speaking of, Catherine Clark Kroger, and she was an American writer, professor, New Testament scholar, leading figure within the biblical egalitarian movement. And she's got a lot of controversy around her. We're not here to talk about her in particular, and those things has nothing to do with today's topic. But she has written that several parts of the Bible refer to King Nebuchadnezzar's behavior in the book of Daniel 4 as being a manifestation of clinical lycanthropy. And this will get us almost into the biblical portion that I want to get to. I do want to bring up another clinical syndrome that can directly relate to this clinical lycanthropy, and I'm going to tell you what I think about it and tell you what I think about the clinical lycanthropy piece. We're going to talk about prosomometamorphopsia, better known as demon face syndrome, or PMO. And we're going to refer to this as demon face syndrome from here on out, but that is the technical name for it. It's a neurological disorder characterized by altered perception of faces. In the perception of a person with the disorder, facial features are distorted in a variety of ways, including drooping, swelling, discoloration, and shifts of position. It's characterized by the inability to recognize faces, and there have only been 75 to 100 cases that have been reported in scientific literature. So this was reported last year in the news. It was all over mainstream, and you'll see some of the pictures pop up here if you're on YouTube or if you're on Rumble. I'm going to show some of that. And the idea is that people have this disorder to where they see people's faces change into demons, right? Now, I know when it came out, the conspiratorial community was up in arms, and rightfully so, I'll say. Rightfully so, because it's been considered to be pushed hard in the mainstream because there are people that are legitimately seeing things that they can't explain, especially when it comes to negative entities. And they're using this as a basis to point to and say, hey, you've got this syndrome. You need to get on this medication. You need this kind of help because you're not actually seeing this. When people are actually seeing negative entities, seeing negative things. So this idea of demon face syndrome, I believe, was pushed by the mainstream to make people feel like they're crazy for seeing things that they actually see. Now, there's the other part of it. Some people might actually have mental health disorders, and they are seeing things aren't really there. Then there's another part that I haven't even talked about yet in this episode. And maybe I'll do an entire episode about this one day, and I think I will. And there have been tons of studies and people who are very open to the supernatural that people who have mental disorders have an affinity to actually see more of the unseen realm too. So you got that aspect. So you've got a multi-layered thing going on here that it's hard to nail down exactly what it is. But I do think that demon face syndrome was pushed very hard to discredit people who are actually seeing things. And even if they do have a disorder, they still may actually be seeing things. So again, back to at the beginning where I said that I believe that when it comes to the paranormal, when it comes to the conspiratorial world, it's just multi-layered. And I think we have to look at it that way because we can't just say that we've got it figured out. And I think this is a prime example of it. And I think that when we're talking about demon face syndrome, which is very new, plays into the ideas of lycanthropy, which has been around for a long time, and how that evolved into more of this is a complete mental disorder and there's nothing supernatural about it. However, Sabine Baring-Gould does constantly throw in the idea of demonic possession, so it's not devoid of the supernatural by any stretch. Now, I did bring up King Nebuchadnezzar, and I brought out Catherine Clark Kroger and how she thinks that what he went through was a manifestation of clinical lycanthropy. I want to argue that I don't think that's the case, and I think he may have gone through actual metamorphosis, and I'm going to show you biblically why I think that, and then you can make your own decision on what you think. You could say he just went mad for 7 years, possibly. I think there might be more to it, and I'll show you why I think that. We're going to go to Daniel 4 for this, and Nebuchadnezzar has this dream of a great tree. So he can't get any of his magicians, enchanters, astrologers, or anyone to figure it out. Very classic Nebuchadnezzar. He always has to go to the bums who can't ever figure it out. And then he's got to go get Daniel and his friends to help him out with these problems. So verse 8, but at last into my presence came Daniel, whose name is Belteshazzar, after the name of my God, and in whom is the spirit of the holy gods. And I told him the dream. O Belteshazzar, chief of the magicians, I know that the spirit of the holy gods is in you, that no mystery baffles you. So explain to me the visions I saw in my dream and their interpretation. These visions of my mind as I was lying in bed, I saw this come to pass. There was a tree in the midst of the land, and its height was great. The tree grew large and strong. Its top reached the sky, and it was visible to the ends of the earth. Its leaves were beautiful, its fruit was abundant, and upon it was food for all. Under it the beasts of the field found shelter, and in its branches the birds of the air nested. And from it every creature was fed. Verse 13, this is important. This is where it gets to the part where I'm going to show you how this works with him actually changing. And as I lay on my bed, I also saw in the visions of my mind a watcher, a holy one, coming down from heaven, called out in a loud voice. So this is a specific type of angel, watcher. We know about the watchers who laid with the daughters of men and created the Nephilim. This is one of those. And the watcher says, cut down the tree and chop off its branches, strip of its leaves and scatter its fruit. Let the beast flee from under it and the birds from its branches, but leave the stump with its roots in the ground with a band of iron and bronze around it. In the tender grass of the field, let him be drenched with the dew of heaven and graze with the beast on the grass of the earth. Let his mind be changed from that of a man, and let him be given the mind of a beast till 7 times pass him by. And in the Hebrew here, of a beast is Hewah, Hewah. Remember that, because I want to come back to that. Verse 17, this decision is the decree of the watchers, the verdict declared by the holy ones, so that the living will know that the Most High rules over the kingdom of mankind and gives to it to whom he wishes, setting over it the lowliest of men. So Daniel tells Nebuchadnezzar, don't worry, the Most High will give me the answer to your dream. And he says in verse 25, you'll be driven away from mankind. Your dwelling will be with the beast of the field. You will feed on grass like an ox and be drenched with the dew of heaven. 7 times shall pass you by, 7 years, until you acknowledge that the Most High rules over the kingdom of man and gives it to whom he wishes. As for the command to leave the stump of the tree with its roots, your kingdom will be restored to you as soon as you acknowledge that heaven rules. Therefore, may my advice be pleasing to you, O king. Break away from your sins by doing what is right, from your iniquities by showing mercy to the oppressed. Perhaps there will be an extension of your prosperity. So it's more of a warning. It hasn't been fulfilled yet. It's a prophecy, but it can be changed because Daniel is telling Nebuchadnezzar to Yahweh, quit following the gods that you're following. But of course, Nebuchadnezzar doesn't. Verse 28, all this happened to King Nebuchadnezzar 12 months later as he was walking on the roof of the royal palace of Babylon. The king exclaimed, is this not Babylon the Great, which I myself have built as a royal residence by the might of my power and for the glory of my majesty? While the words were still in the king's mouth, a voice came from heaven. It is decreed to you, King Nebuchadnezzar, that the kingdom has departed from you. You will be driven away from mankind to live with the beasts of the field, and you will feed on grass like an ox. And 7 times will pass you by until you acknowledge that the Most High rules over the kingdom of mankind and gives it to whom he wishes. That moment, the sentence against Nebuchadnezzar was fulfilled. He was driven away from mankind. He ate grass like an ox, and his body was drenched with the dew of heaven till his hair grew like the feathers of an eagle and his nails like the claws of a bird. But at the end of those days, the 7 years, I, Nebuchadnezzar, looked up to heaven and my sanity was restored to me. Then I praised the Most High and honored and glorified him who lives forever. Verse 36, at the same time my sanity was restored, my honor and splendor returned to me for the glory of my kingdom. So he humbles himself before God and the insanity leaves him. If we look at it just as insanity, right? But let's look at that word again in the prophecy, Hewah, of a beast. And we know that the watcher told him that. Now, we know that the watchers from the book of Enoch were corrupting men with science, with alchemy, all of these things. So we've got this connection. You may say, well, where's the connection here to this? Well, there's only 2 other places where Hewah has been used in the Bible, and we have to go to Daniel 7 for that. And this is when Daniel has a dream about the future, and we're not going to get into what the dreams mean because that's a whole different episode, but we want to talk about 2 verses. We want to talk about verse 5. This is when the 4 great beasts came up out of the sea, each one different from the others. Suddenly another beast appeared, which looked like a bear. It was raised up on one of its sides. It had 3 ribs in its mouth between its teeth. So it was told, get up and gorge yourself on flesh. Verse 7, after this, As I watched my vision in the night, suddenly a fourth beast appeared, and it was terrifying, dreadful, and extremely strong. With large iron teeth, it devoured and crushed, and it trampled underfoot whatever was left. It was different from all the beasts before it and had 10 horns. While I was contemplating the horns, suddenly another horn, a little one, came up among them, and 3 of the first horns were uprooted before it. The horn had eyes like those of a man and a mouth that spoke words of arrogance. Of a beast in both of those verses is also Hewa. And these are beasts, metaphoric beasts, but they are hybrid type beasts nonetheless. So if we're going to suggest that those beasts are indescribable, even though the one is described as bear-like, we have to think that because of that Hebrew meaning there, we know that the Hebrew word Hewa was used when the watcher tells Nebuchadnezzar in the dream that he will become a beast who will eat of the grass and also go crazy for 7 years, essentially, until he comes to his sanity and then decides to follow God. So in that aspect, if we're looking at that Hebrew word, Hewa, Hewa, and we know that this word is in conjunction with horrible, terrible beast, and it's only used one other time, and when it's used, it's talking about Nebuchadnezzar changing into this beast. We have to suggest the possibility that he actually changed into some sort of horrible beast, possibly some sort of lichen, some actual form of lycanthropy. And lycanthropy can also tail into changing into other animals, right? And Sabine Baring-Gould talks about that in his book. I think that when we look at that word in the Hebrew and we connect those verses, we can definitely say that Nebuchadnezzar changed into something that was more than just being a crazy man in the woods for 7 years. Especially when we look at how supernatural the Bible is, and we look at some of the extra canonical texts, and we talk about hybrids and giants and everything else. It's not a stretch to say that Nebuchadnezzar had fallen to actual lycanthropy. Well, guys, I had a blast as always. I appreciate all of you for being here for the start of a brand new year of Free the Rabbits. Right now, guys, if you haven't and you've been listening to the show, one, go follow it, because I know how many people listen to the show, and I'm like, why are they not hitting follow on Spotify or Apple? Make sure you're following the show. Make sure you're sharing it to other people to follow the show. Number 2, make sure you're giving it a 5-star review on Spotify, on Apple Podcast. Make sure you're writing a review on Apple Podcast. If you're on YouTube, go comment below. I know you're part of the live chat for the premiere and you were typing away there. Just go type down below. If you're just catching the video now and you're on YouTube, go comment below, even if you like it. You know, people are notorious for hitting like, but they don't comment. Comments help the video get deeper into the algorithm and helps it grow. And make sure you share it too, whatever platform you're on. Again, I really appreciate everyone who's been helping this grow. I appreciate everyone who's now helping the show grow too. I appreciate all of you. On the way out, we're going to listen to my brand new song, Imposter. It is the single from the new documentary we have coming out next month called The Meadow Project. Make sure you look out for that. All right, guys, you know what it is. Go outside, touch grass, and get your tail out the hole.
I'm in a fun house, locked in a boxcar with all of these clowns. dreams that feel like nightmares, will they end? My reality's more friendly than pretend. And I don't know if my perception's innocent. I'm never satisfied, I'm looking to transcend. Real me gets confused with the clones I create on my own. My palace corridors to the lab, it's a throne. Pyramids of deception above the halls of a minty. If I leave, will I even miss me? Yeah. Face to face with my ambition, yeah. My position with me, I'm in competition, yeah. I could be superstitious, cause it feels like it's a sickness.